think we can all agree that Final Fantasy XIV is getting a lot of things right these days, but what specifically is it that it does so much better than its competitors, especially compared to the flaming corpse of World of Warcraft? Here are my top 3 things Final Fantasy does better than other MMOs. You could argue that Final Fantasy XIV is one of the single best examples of balanced classes in a video game, especially considering how many different classes are available. I want to be clear, this does not mean that all classes are completely equal. Quite the contrary, there will always be tier lists and there's always a few classes that are performing better than others and some that aren't quite as powerful. But all classes are always completely viable, something that isn't true in other games even outside of MMOs. Looking at you, most guns in Destiny. A good player at a weaker class will still outperform a bad player at a stronger class, something that is actually and sadly fairly unique to Final Fantasy. This allows the player to pick based on which class appeals to them instead of which class is dominating the latest raid, which is honestly enormously freeing. I know that personally I've been guilty of switching characters in WoW to play as a higher performing class just so that I could enjoy raiding, which is kind of ironic because even that wouldn't have to be a thing in Final Fantasy due to how they handle classes, but we'll come back to that in a minute. Part of this whole phenomenon comes from the more relaxed culture of the game, where players don't tend to be hyper-focused on achieving the absolute highest DPS at all costs. Even if the classes weren't so well balanced, I don't think the player base would care as much as they would if it were any other game, because encounters tend to be designed where the mechanics are more important than raw DPS. Luckily though, we don't even have to test my theory because the classes are extremely well balanced, which I believe is a huge part of Final Fantasy XIV's appeal. I'll keep this part short because I think it's well documented at this point that Final Fantasy XIV has a great story, but when I went into it, I thought that meant a great story compared to other MMOs, which, let's be honest, other than a few exceptions, tend to barely have a story at all. Instead, Final Fantasy just has a great story all around, at least once you start getting toward the end of the A Realm Reborn stuff, so up until about level 50. I have shed a tear not once but twice during the story. To be fair, it was a super melee tear. Something that hasn't happened to me during very many games at all, and definitely never during an MMO. The characters are all great with lots of layers of depth, and perhaps even more importantly, most of the enemy characters seem to have clear and consistent motivations, slipping more into that morally gray area than black and white good versus evil. It makes for much more compelling stuff, and there are plenty of twists and turns along the way. I can't wait to see more. The number one thing that Final Fantasy XIV does over other MMOs is simple. The developers and the game itself respect the player and their time. This can be seen in virtually every single design mechanic of the game, from the level sync ability that keeps all content perpetually relevant, unlike some competitors, time walking cough cough, to the way that the player doesn't even have to take the time to loot fallen enemies to claim the reward. The first time I ran a dungeon and players weren't kneeling down over a corpse after every encounter with trash mobs, it absolutely blew my mind. And that's all before taking into account the way the player can simply change classes at any time, allowing you to play all the classes on a single character. And that means keeping your items and mounts and ability to fly even as you start at level 1 on a new class. As a former altaholic, I can't even put into words how liberating this was for me. Weirdly, it allowed me to focus on one class because I never got that feeling that I was wasting my time. If I hated playing as a white mage, which I don't, I love it, it would still be helpful for me to keep making progress even if I eventually switch to a gunbreaker or a ninja or a dancer or even a reaper or sage when Endwalker comes out.
Guys, there's so many cool classes in this game.
In other games, I always have at least a little bit of fear that I'm going to have to start all the way over if I decide I want to play as another class. Being so fluid takes a ton of pressure off of one of the biggest choices in an MMO, and it's totally in line with Final Fantasy XIV's overall respectful attitude toward its players. One small disclaimer though, the beginning part of A Realm Reborn doesn't really fit with this description, with the insane amount of traveling back and forth just to talk to a single NPC. On the other hand, the fact that this is addressed and fixed almost completely by the time you reach the game's expansions shows that the developers actually listen and respond to player feedback. It's almost like the devs don't utterly despise the players or something. It's
Really weird.
But it just goes to show that Final Fantasy XIV is more respectful to the player compared to other MMOs. So those are the top 3 things that Final Fantasy XIV does better than other MMOs. I have to admit this video was a bit of an experiment for me as far as subject matter, so please let me know in the comments if you agree or disagree, and especially please like and subscribe to let me know you'd be interested in seeing more of this type of content. Thanks for watching.